G'day Year 11 students. I just wanted to go through the couple of ideas around how we finish our assignment. That is, using legal studies criteria to justify a decision, also talking about the implications, which is the last part of the section. So let's have a look at what we've got to do. Here's the criteria that we've got to look. So the first thing you've got to do is put together relevant legal alternatives. So relevant legal alternatives isn't too high a bar. It just means those are legal alternatives, two ideas that have to be linked to what you've already discussed. So for example, if we're thinking about vaping, you might have discussed the health issues of vaping. So a legal alternative that might come from that is you might say, well, the government should ban all imports of vaping materials into Australia and have significant penalties to act as a deterrent. That's just a relevant legal alternative that flows on that. Then we've got a justify decision based on legal criteria, and we'll talk about that, and then discuss the implications, discuss what happens after the decision. So legal criteria is that we can use, it can be elements of the rule of law. For example, a key part of the rule of law is that everyone is equal before the law. It could be something that exists already in common or statutory law. So statutory law is law passed by parliaments, common law is law made by courts. And the one that we use most often, I think, is just or equitable outcomes. I think just and equitable outcomes are the most common. Sometimes you can use elements of the rule of law. So let's use just and equitable outcomes this time. Just means it's legally right. It's lawful or fair. And that's what just means, legally right, lawful or fair. And equitable means even and impartial. So we think about how our decision is just, legally right, have to explain what it is, and equitable, why it's even and impartial. And I'm going to go through an example a little bit later on to hopefully help with that idea. So and then once we've done the use of legal criteria, we move on to discussion of the relevant implications. So an implication is an effect, a consequence. This shouldn't be hard to do, but there's a little trick there in that the word is fluent. It has to be a fluent discussion of the implications of the decision. So I want to give an example. Right? Last year we did an assignment that was based on the age of criminal responsibility. Currently it's 10 across Australia, but there's a lot of pressure to move it to it being higher, that 10-year-olds aren't really aware of the circumstances enough of to take criminal responsibility and end up, in some cases, in jail. So we're going to go that I've made a decision here. So let's say I've made a decision. The Queensland Government should legislate 14 as the minimum age of criminal responsibility, and for offenders younger than this, support them with resources including counselling, education, support and mentoring. So that's my decision. Now, having made a decision, we've got to justify that using legal criteria. Is it legally right, and is it equitable, even and impartial? Let's have a look. I start by looking at legally right, okay? And I use a little research here to justify it. Tracy Westerman is a psychologist, and the article she wrote took about the fact that children under the age of 14 aren't consistently able to understand the consequences of their actions. So I've linked it to the legal principle of mens rea, so people have to have an awareness that they're insight into the fact they're committing a crime. And so the legal principle of mens rea means that if someone does not understand their actions, they should not be convicted of a crime. So there you go. I've said this is legally right because young people don't understand the consequences of the actions, and that means that if someone doesn't understand their actions, they should not be convicted of a crime. Let's have a look at saying, okay, the next part is equitable. How do I say whether this is equitable? Equitable means even and impartial. In this case, I use some evidence that says in the developed world, the median, the middle age of criminal responsibility is 14. So if the Queensland Government raised the minimum age of criminal responsibility to 14, it would be equitable, even with what's happening in the rest of the world. So raising the age of criminal responsibility would be equitable and is consistent with the median age of criminal responsibility worldwide, meaning Australian children will be treated in the same way as children in other countries. So now we've used both just legally right, to explain why we think our decision is the correct one, and equitable, why we think it's equitable, even impartial, thinking of a good, why it's then a good decision. Now, the last part is the implication. Implication is just the effects, results, consequences. If we skip back here we've got it, the effects, results, or consequences that may happen in the future. And I guess they're all implied in this case because we're talking about usually talking about a change to the law. Something's going to happen in the future. So, what's going to happen in the future if we change the criminal age of responsibility to 14, we increase it to 14? I've said it will mean that there are no longer children in custody and detention under the age of 14, possibly when they're in detention, possibly leading them to a life of repeat offending. And I've got a source there who talks about repeat offending. Instead, children under the age of 14 will offer support, rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is an important legal word. Remember, that's one of the aims of punishment. So we want to try and use that legal language as much as we can. Instead, children under the age of 14 will be offered support, rehabilitation with a focus on reducing the likelihood of future offending. The government will need to decide on how to treat children under the age of 14 currently in detention and custody, transitioning them from custody to the support service. So one of the implications is there's a whole bunch of young people under the age of 14 currently in detention or custody. So how do you transition them out? So there will be the implications. When we put this all together, let's think what we've got. I've got our decision, Queensland should legislate 14 as the minimum age of criminal responsibility. Then I've got justified using legal criteria. Decision to raise the age of 14 is just as it's consistent with expert opinions around young people not being able to consistently understand actions, which links to mens rea. It says that you shouldn't be convicted of a crime unless you have that insight. I've then said it would be equitable as consistent with the median age of criminal responsibility worldwide, meaning Australian children will be treated in the same way, equitable, as children in other countries. Implications, so increasing the age of criminal responsibility to 14, mean there are no longer children in custody and detention, possibly influencing towards that possibility of repeat offending. Instead, they'll be offered support and rehabilitation, reducing the likelihood of future offending, and the government will need to decide how to treat children under the age of 14 currently in detention and custody. Now, let's just have a few thoughts about how that might translate to the topic of vapes. Let's say your decision is, I think we might have talked earlier on about a decision saying we're going to ban the importation of vapes and put a significant penalty for anyone caught importing vapes. So what are some justification? Well, why is it, first of all, is it just? Why is it just? You might say it's just because it's consistent with the idea that vapes do a lot of damage and that we want to try and protect the community from that damage, that health harm. Okay. Equitable? How could that be equitable? We might look at the law around other drugs that do damage and find that there are significant penalties for people importing drugs generally, and because vapes containing nicotine are also a drug that's doing a significant amount of harm, similarly to those other drugs, there should be serious penalties. So we've justified the decision on the basis that it is just and equitable. What are some implications of banning all imports of vapes? Well, hopefully we'll see less vapes in the community. We might have to be very careful that there isn't an increase in the number of people manufacturing vapes in Australia and decide what we want to do about that. But there are two little implications that flow easily from that into this part of the assignment.